believed battleships were relics of the past, obsolete in the age of fast-moving aircraft carriers. Their role was considered to be more of a defense tool, guarding carriers rather than engaging in direct combat. But that all changed one fateful night off Guadalcanal. The USS Washington, a massive battleship armed with 16-inch guns and cutting-edge radar, was about to challenge everything the Navy had come to believe. At 2,300 hours, with the sky black and no moonlight to reveal the enemy, the Washington silently tracked a fleet of 9 Japanese warships. They were unaware that the American battleship, cloaked in darkness, was already watching their every move through the new radar technology that most in the Navy didn't yet fully understand. This was not a battle of visual sighting where ships could spot each other with searchlights. This was a battle of technology, of precision, and of boldness. The Japanese fleet, relying on outdated methods, had no idea what was coming, and as they advanced, the USS Washington's crew knew they had the upper hand because they could see in the dark, and the enemy could not. This is the story of how one ship, with a revolutionary system and a commander who saw its potential, defied conventional naval wisdom. How she proved that the battleship, when used with the right technology and tactics, could still dominate the modern naval battlefield. And how in just 7 minutes the USS Washington's radar-directed guns obliterated a fleet, changing the course of the Pacific War forever. At 2,300 hours on November 14, 1942, the radar operators aboard USS Washington tracked 9 Japanese warships, moving through the darkness 18,000 yards away. The enemy force was invisible to the naked eye in the pitch-black waters north of Guadalcanal, but on Washington's SG radar screens, every ship appeared as a distinct green blip, their positions updated to every sweep of the antenna. The Japanese fleet, still relying on searchlights and binoculars, had no idea an American battleship was watching their every move. For 16 months, the crew of Washington had trained with this revolutionary technology. The SG surface search radar could detect ships at ranges that seemed impossible to atom. The Marquee fire control radar could track targets and calculate firing solutions in complete darkness. Together, these systems gave Washington the ability to fight blind, to kill what she could not see. But in November 1942, nobody in the Pacific Fleet truly believed a battleship could win a modern naval battle. That assumption was about to cost American lives. The admirals called battleships screening vessels floating at aircraft platforms, expensive escorts reduced to protecting carriers like oversized destroyers. Official doctrine stated that battleships were obsolete, relegated to throwing up flak while carriers did the real fighting. Since Pearl Harbor, the fast battleships had been kept on a tight leash, forbidden to seek surface engagements, restricted to defensive roles. Washington had crossed the Atlantic, served with the British home fleet, transferred to the Pacific, and in all that time had never once fired her main battery at an enemy warship. Tonight, that would change. Tonight, one ship and one admiral would prove that battleships properly employed with the right technology could still dominate a naval battlefield. But first, the 3,700 Americans aboard Washington would have to survive what was about to become the most violent surface action of the Pacific War. The battleship was not the problem. Washington was a masterpiece of American engineering. The second ship of the North Carolina class laid down at Philadelphia Navy Yard on June 14, 1938. She displaced 35,000 tons standard, 44,800 tons fully loaded. Her main battery consisted of 96 and Mark 6 guns and 3 triple turrets, capable of hurling 2,700 pounds armor-piercing shells over 20 meters. Her belt armor was 16 in thick. Her turret faces 18 in. For General Electric turbines generated 121,000 shaft horsepower, driving her through the water at 28 knots. She could fight, she could run, she could absorb punishment, but in the twisted logic of 1940 naval doctrine, she was considered too valuable to risk in the very role she was designed for, ship-to-ship combat. 3 nights earlier, the cost of that doctrine had been paid in blood. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan had led Task Force 67 into these same waters to intercept a Japanese bombardment force. His ships included the heavy cruisers San Francisco and Portland, the light cruiser Helena, the anti-aircraft cruisers Juno and Atlanta, and 8 destroyers. It should have been a powerful force, but Callahan had no battleships. The Navy had exactly 2 operational battleships in the entire South Pacific theater, Washington and South Dakota, and they were being held back with the carrier Enterprise, the only functional American carrier left in the Pacific. Doctrine said carriers were too precious to risk. Battleships existed to protect carriers, so Callahan went in without them. The result was catastrophe. In a confused night action that historians would later call the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, Callahan's force stumbled into Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe's bombardment group in the darkness. The Japanese had 2 battleships, Hei and Kirishima, the heavy cruiser Kinugasa to light cruisers, and 14 destroyers. What followed was not a battle, but a barroom brawl with naval guns. Ships fired at point-blank range, unable to distinguish friend from foe. American ships shot at each other. Japanese searchlights turned the night into a nightmare of glare and shadow. When the smoke cleared, Callahan was dead on San Francisco's bridge, killed by a direct hit from a 14-inch shell. Rear Admiral Norman Scott was dead aboard Atlanta, killed by American shells fired in confusion. The destroyers Barton, Cushing, Laffey, and Monson were sinking or sunk. Atlanta was dying. Juno would be torpedoed and lost with nearly all hands while withdrawing. 706 Americans were dead. The Japanese had lost only the destroyers Akatsuki and Adachi, though the battleship Hei was crippled and would be sunk by air attack the next day. Admiral Chester Nimitz, sitting in his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, read the after-action reports. With growing alarm, the Marines on Guadalcanal were barely holding. Henderson Field, the airstrip that made Guadalcanal worth dying for, was under nightly bombardment from Japanese cruisers and destroyers. Now intelligence reported another even larger Japanese force heading south. Admiral Naoto Kondo was coming with the battleship Kirishima for heavy cruisers, to light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. Their mission was to pound Henderson Field into rubble, then cover the landing of 11,000 fresh Japanese troops. If they succeeded, Guadalcanal would fall. The Marines would be slaughtered. The first American offensive of the Pacific War would end in disaster. Nimitz faced an impossible choice. Doctrine said never risk battleships without carrier support, but Enterprise was damaged and operating with a patch flight deck from the Battle of Santa Cruz. 3 weeks earlier, her air group was depleted. If Nimitz held the battleships back to screen the carrier, Henderson Field would be destroyed. Guadalcanal would fall, and months of blood and sacrifice would be wasted. If he sent the battleships forward alone, they might all be sunk, leaving Enterprise defenseless. Every principle he had been taught at the Naval War College said this was wrong. Every war game he had ever participated in said battleships operating alone at night were doomed. But the Marines were out of time. Nimitz made the hardest decision of his career. He ordered Admiral William Halsey to release the battleships. Send them in alone. Let them fight ship to ship. Doctrine be damned. The man chosen to lead this desperate mission was Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee Jr. At 54 years old, Lee was an unlikely warrior. Born in Natalie, Kentucky, a tiny town in Owen County, he had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1908. Short, stocky, and perpetually disheveled, Lee looked more like a rural school teacher than an admiral. His uniforms never fit right. He wore thick glasses. He spoke with a Kentucky drawl that made other officers underestimate him. But behind that unimpressive exterior was one of the finest tactical minds in the United States Navy. Lee was a marksman without peer. At the 1920 Olympics in Antwerp, he had won 5 gold medals to silver medals, and 1 bronze medal in shooting events. He could put 10 shots through the same hole at 1,000 yards. He understood ballistics the way musicians understand rhythm instinctively, perfectly. Trajectories, windage, bullet drop, lead angles. They were not calculations to him, but intuitions. When he looked at a target, he knew where to aim. When he transitioned from rifles to naval guns, that intuition came with him. A 16-inch naval rifle was just a very large rifle to Willis Lee. The principles were the same. You calculated the principles. Target's position. You led it based on its speed and direction. You adjusted for wind and motion and you fired. The only difference was scale. But Lee understood something even more important than gunnery. He understood technology. Specifically, he understood radar in a way that most admirals in 1942 did not. while his contemporaries treated radar as an interesting novelty, a gadget that might supplement visual spotting. Lee recognized it as a revolution in naval warfare. A ship with radar could see through darkness, through smoke, through rain. It could track targets at ranges that made visual engagement impossible. It could calculate firing solutions with mathematical precision. Most importantly, it could allow one ship to dominate a battlefield where the enemy was fighting blind. For 6 months, Lee had been drilling his crews relentlessly on radar-directed gunnery. He redesigned Washington's fire control procedures from the ground up. In the standard Navy system, the radar operator reported contacts to a talker who relayed them to the gunnery officer, who ordered the gun directors who aimed the guns. Lee eliminated the middleman. He had the radar operators wired directly to the gunnery officer and gun directors. The radar plot officer could designate targets in real time. The fire control radar could track the fall of shot and correct aim between salvos. It was a system that had never been tested in combat. Lee had developed it through hundreds of hours of drilling, refining, perfecting. Now he would find out if it worked when it mattered. Lee's task force was designated Task Force 64. It consisted of his flagship Washington, the battleship South Dakota, and for destroyers, Benham, Preston, and Gwin. On paper, it looked impressive. 2 of America's newest battleships with destroyer escort. In reality, it was a scratch team that had never worked together. South Dakota had just arrived from the States after repairs from the Plains 26 to the Plains-Aridin Battle of Santa Cruz, where she had been hit by a Japanese bomb. Her crew was green, many of them fresh from training. The 4 destroyers had been pulled from different task groups. They had never operated with the battleships. There had been no time for exercises, no opportunity to develop common procedures. Lee had exactly 1 day to weld this collection of ships into a fighting force. The problems went deeper than just unfamiliarity. Washington and South Dakota had incompatible radio systems. Their talk between ship sets operated on different frequencies. Their recognition signals were different. Lee discovered this only after they were already at sea. He had to jury-rig a communication plan on the fly using signal lights and predetermined maneuvers, because the ships literally could not talk to each other reliably. The destroyers had their own problems. They were armed with 5-inch guns and torpedoes, weapons designed for close-range knife fights. Against Japanese cruisers and battleships, they would be outgunned and outranged. Their only advantage was their torpedoes, but to use them, they would have to close to under 10,000 yards, well within range of Japanese guns. As the sun set on November 14th, Lee took his small force round the western tip of Guadalcanal. The 4 destroyers led in column formation, Walker in the lead, then Benham, Preston, and Gwin, followed by the 2 battleships with Washington leading South Dakota. The column stretched for over to me, 6 ships heading into waters that had already claimed dozens of American vessels. The sailors had taken to calling it Iron Bottom Sound because so many ships rested on the seafloor as they rounded Savo Island. Every man aboard could see the oil slicks and debris from Callahan's battle 3 nights before. Bodies still floated in the water. The wreckage of American destroyers broke the surface at low tide. Lee knew what he was heading into. Intelligence had provided only detailed information about Kondo's force. The Japanese admiral was bringing the battleship Kirishima, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and dozens of battles since. She was technically a battle cruiser built during World War I and modernized in the 1930s, but her 814-inch guns could throw 2,800 pounds shells 19 miles. With her were the heavy cruisers Tarago and Takao, each armed with 10 8-inch guns. The light cruisers Sensai and Nagara, and 9 destroyers. 14 ships total, each one trained in night fighting, each one armed with the Type 93 torpedo, what the Americans called the Longlands, the deadliest torpedo in the world. It could run 12 miles at 49 knots with a 0.0-pound warhead. One hit could break a cruiser in half, 2 or 3 could sink a battleship. The Japanese had been training for night surface combat for 20 years. They had developed tactics, equipment, and doctrines specifically for fighting in darkness. Their lookouts were selected for superior night vision and trained to superhuman levels of skill. They could spot ship silhouettes at ranges that seemed impossible to American sailors. Their star shells and searchlights could turn night into day. Their torpedo tactics were refined to perfection. They had proven their superiority in night combat again and again at Java Sea, at Savo Island, at Cape Esperance. American sailors had learned to fear the night. The darkness belonged to the Japanese, but Lee had something the Japanese did not expect. He had radar, and more importantly, he knew how to use it. As Task Force 64 moved through the Sound, Washington's radar operators tracked every contact. They could see the mountains of Guadalcanal and Savo Island. They could track friendly aircraft returning to Henderson Field. Most importantly, they could see the Japanese coming from 20 meters away, far beyond visual range. At 225-152, radar detected the first enemy ships, a group of destroyers sweeping ahead of the main force, range 18,000 yards and closing. Lee faced a critical decision. He could open fire at maximum range, using his radar advantage to hit the Japanese before they knew he was there. But that would reveal his position, alert Kondo to the trap, and possibly allow the Japanese admiral to abort his bombardment mission and escape. Or he could wait. Let the Japanese commit to their attack run. Let them get close enough that they could not escape, then spring the ambush. It was a terrible risk. The closer the Japanese got, the more likely they would spot the American force. If they saw Lee's ships first, if they launched their torpedoes first, Task Force 64 would be annihilated. But Lee understood something crucial. The Japanese were not looking for a surface engagement. They were expecting aircraft from Henderson Field, PT boats, submarines, anything but American battleships. Halsey had kept the bro battleship movement so secret that even many American commanders did not know they were coming. Lee bet everything on Japanese overconfidence. He ordered his ships to hold fire and maintain course. The range closed 16,000 YD, 14,000, 12,000 on Washington's bridge. Men could hear their hearts beating. The radar operators called out ranges in hushed voices. 10,000 yards. At this range, Japanese lookouts should have spotted the massive silhouettes of two battleships. But the Japanese were looking toward Guadalcanal, expecting to see the flashes of their bombardment. They were not looking behind them. 8,000 yards. Lee could wait no longer. At 2,300 hours exactly, he gave the order to open fire. Washington's first salvo erupted into the night. 916-inch shells, 24. 300 pounds of steel and explosive arc through the darkness toward the light cruiser Sendai. The shells were radar-directed, aimed at a target the gun crews could not see, adjusted by a fire control computer that calculated the precise lead and elevation. The salvo took 23 seconds to reach the target. It missed, but not by much. Giant columns of water erupted around Sai, close enough to drench her decks. Her captain, realizing he was under fire from heavy guns, immediately ordered evasive action and smoke. But Lee was not focused on Sendai. She was a distraction, a secondary target. Washington's radar had identified a much more important target, the destroyer Iron Army, leading the Japanese van. She was closest to the American destroyers, most dangerous to Lee's screen. The second salvo shifted to her. This time, Washington's guns did not miss. At least one 16-inch shell, possibly two, slammed into Iron Army. At that range, against a destroyer's thin armor, the effect was catastrophic. The shell punched through her hull like paper, detonated in her engine room, and blew her machinery spaces apart. Iron Army went dead in the water, burning furiously, her crew desperately fighting floods and fires. The night exploded into chaos. South Dakota opened fire seconds after Washington, her guns tracking different targets. The American destroyers charged forward, trying to get into torpedo range. Japanese star shells burst overhead, bathing the Sound in greenish-white light. Searchlights snapped on, probing the darkness. Every ship was firing at something, but in the confusion, it was impossible to tell who was shooting at whom. Tracers crisscrossed the water in every direction. The thunder of heavy guns mixed with the rapid crack of destroyer weapons. It was Callahan's battle all over again. Except this time, the Americans had radar. Then disaster struck. At 237, South Dakota suffered a massive electrical failure. Her chief engineer trying to correct a minor problem with her electrical electrical board, accidentally through the main circuit breakers. Every electrical system on the ship died instantly. Lights went out. Radar screens went black. Gun directors lost power. Ammunition hoist stopped. In seconds, one of America's most powerful battleships was reduced to a floating target. Emergency diesel generators kicked in, but they could only power essential systems. The main battery could still fire in local control, but without radar, without directors. The gunners were shooting blind. The Japanese pounced on the crippled battleship. Searchlights from Kirishima and the cruisers locked onto South Dakota, illuminating her like a stage performer. Every Japanese ship that could bring guns to bear opened fire. 14-inch shells from Kirishima slammed into South Dakota's superstructure. 8-inch shells from Targatago and Takao ripped through her upper works. In 90 seconds, South Dakota took 27 hits. Her radio antennas were shot away. Her radar was destroyed. Her secondary battery was knocked out. 38 sailors and 1 Marine was killed. 59 more were wounded, including Captain Thomas Gatch, who was hit by shrapnel, but remained on the bridge. The American destroyers were faring even worse. They had charged into the Japanese formation trying to launch torpedoes, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Preston was the first to die, caught in a crossfire between Japanese cruisers and destroyers. She was hit repeatedly. Shells ripped through her thin hull, starting uncontrollable fires. Her captain ordered abandoned ship, but before most of the crew could get off, her magazines detonated. Preston disappeared in a ball of fire, taking 117 men with her. Walk went next, leading the American destroyer column. She had pressed closest to the Japanese line. She managed to launch several torpedoes, but before she could turn away, Japanese return fire found her. Shells smashed into her bridge, killing her captain. More shells hit her engine room. Then a long-lance torpedo slammed into her hull. Amidships, Walkie broke in half and sank in minutes. Of her crew of 250 men, only 75 survived. Benham was hit by a torpedo that blew her bow completely off. Somehow, she remained afloat, her watertight bulkheads holding, but she could no longer fight or maneuver. Gwen, the last destroyer still operational, was burning from multiple shell hits, but still had power and steerage. Her captain made the bitter decision to withdraw, picking up survivors as she retreated. In less than 15 minutes, Lee's destroyer screen had been annihilated. By 23:15, Lee's task force had effectively ceased to exist, for destroyers were sunk or crippled. South Dakota was blind, deaf, and on fire, limping away from the battle. Of the 6 ships that had entered Iron Bottom Sound, only Washington remained operational. She was alone facing 14 Japanese ships, including a battleship, for cruisers, and multiple destroyers. Every war college scenario, every tactical manual, every piece of conventional wisdom said Lee should withdraw immediately. He was outnumbered 14-1. He had no support. No one would blame him for saving his ship and crew. But Willis Lee looked at his radar screen and saw something the Japanese could not see. In their excitement at pounding South Dakota, in the adrenaline rush of destroying American destroyers, the Japanese had lost their formation. Their ships were scattered, some pursuing South Dakota, some finishing off destroyers, some milling about in confusion, and none of them had noticed Washington. She had been hidden behind the burning wrecks of Preston and Wa. Her radar signature masked by the surrounding carnage. Lee had an opportunity, but it would require doing something that violated every principle of battleship combat. He would have to charge alone into the middle of an enemy fleet. Lee gave the order that would define his place in naval history. Complete silence on all radio circuits. No lights, no communication with other ships. Maximum speed ahead. Course 030. Washington accelerated to 26 knots and headed straight for the Japanese battle line. Her radar operators tracked every enemy ship, calling out ranges and bearings in whispers. 15,000 ids to Kirishima, 12,000 to Otago, 10,000 to Takao. The Japanese still had not seen her. Their searchlights were focused on South Dakota, now burning on the southern horizon. Their lookouts were watching their victims die. No one was looking for another battleship. At 8,000 for 100 ids, practically point-blank range for battleship guns. Lee gave the order to open fire on Kirishima, Washington's entire main battery. 9 16-inch guns erupted in a perfectly coordinated salvo. At that range, with radar fire control with a stationary target illuminated by her own searchlights, Washington's gunners could not miss. The first salvo straddled Kirishima. The second was a direct hit, then another and another.